This is Living Catholic with Father Don Wolf. Living Catholic is a fresh look at issues confronting each of us today. This show deals with living Catholic, what that means for Catholics, as well as the impact on the rest of society. You certainly don't have to be Catholic to enjoy this show. And now your host, Father Don Wolf.
Welcome, Oklahoma, to Living Catholic. I'm Father Don Wolf, pastor of Sacred Heart Parish and rector of the Shrine of Blessed Stanley Rother. And just recently, in fact, a week and a half ago, I had a chance to visit Guatemala and our former mission of Santiago Atitlan. It was my first trip there since 2021. I enjoy the opportunity to renew my acquaintance with the country and with the people in the parishes there. There's so much to our Oklahoma Catholic history there as well, and so much to my own personal priestly history, too. It's always a blessing to me when I have a chance to spend some time there. The most obvious and powerful fact about Santiago, actually, is the church building. The parish was founded in 1547, and the church now present was built in the 1590s. Mexico was conquered in 1519, which means the Spanish missionaries were present and setting up shop in this remote highland site just 30 years after the conquest of the Aztec Empire 1,000 miles to the north. Just for some perspective, we haven't founded a new parish in Oklahoma City in 30 years. In 30 years, they were there founding this parish in the Mayan highlands. The irrepressible missionary effort in the Americas, the most successful of all evangelization efforts in the history of Christianity, had parishes founded and churches built all over this part of the world in record time. Santiago Atitlan is a product of this powerful history. My first encounter with the church there was in 1983, when I had the chance to visit Guatemala City and then travel out to the parish of Santiago Atitlan on the second anniversary of Father Stan Rother's murder. A group of us from the Priest Council agreed to visit Guatemala in order to evaluate the situation in the parish there, the parish which Oklahoma had sponsored as a mission beginning in 1965. We wanted to see if we thought it was viable to send other missionaries to take Father Rother's place. 8 of us made the trip, along with Father Malahan, the editor of the Sooner Catholic, and a friend of Father Rother's who had made the trip several times before. It was, for all of us, an eye-opening experience. As we landed at the Guatemala City airport, we made our way through the old terminal there. It seemed as if the whole place was lit by a couple of 25-watt light bulbs, just barely enough to light the way through the hallways and into immigration and customs. Soldiers were posted throughout and easily outnumbered the few of us who were arriving on the plane. There was great tension in the air as the soldiers stood looking at us, their weapons loaded and ready. If by some means we had been unaware of what was going on in the country, our frosty welcome that night would have told us we were stepping into a world marked more by darkness than by light. We were met by the Vicar General of the Diocese of Sololá, who had come to the capital to meet us. He cautioned us about the city and the situation, which was as tense everywhere as it was at the airport. Loaded up on a small bus, we made our way through the streets to the house of the Archbishop of Guatemala City. This entire city was under martial law, which caused the streets to be empty and quiet. Can you imagine a Latin city without one person on the sidewalks or one car on the streets? That was Guatemala City when we arrived there then. As we came through the front door of the Archbishop's house, we were told to remain there until it was time to go to the hotel in our bus. Although the hotel was only a few blocks away, we were not to go out of the house for even a moment, as we would be vulnerable to the imposition of shot-on-sight orders as part of the lockdown there. It didn't take us much time to understand how to behave and how to keep ourselves aware of what we had stepped into. The following day, we made our way through the countryside to Lago Atitlan. The paradox of the country became more and more obvious as we motored through the valleys and mountains separating us from the mission. Guatemala is a beautiful place, and as the sun rose and we could see the tropical spread of vegetation and rich landscape, it seemed the darkness of the previous night was a kind of cheat. The more time we spent in country, the more quickly we saw that violence and shadow couldn't define it. This was highlighted as we came upon the lake for the first time. It's a large crater lake set in the highlands between volcanoes. In the sunshine there, it's almost turquoise and captures the eye as nothing else. Knowing this was the place that Stan Rother had come to, had fallen in love with, and had chosen to risk death to stay in, made it all the more intriguing. After a night at the shoreside town on the far side of the lake and dinner with the local Benedictine monks there, we prepared ourselves for the following day. We boated across the lake to Santiago, Atitlan, and were greeted by hundreds of people at the docks there. They led us up the narrow, dusty street to the city center and then on to the open church plaza. To the right of the church were the ruins of the old classrooms and convent of a previous age that had been destroyed by the great earthquake of 1976. We found a small space there among the collapsed stones and concretes where we could change into our vestments and join the procession into the church. There were a number of the local clergy as well as several of the Benedictines from across the lake. We joined up in our procession and moved out onto the plaza to make our way into the church. 1,000 people greeted us there in the plaza, each festooned in the local dress, many holding smoking cans of incense and palm leaves. All of them were standing there as part of the celebration because the church was already full. As we entered, we were greeted by the smell of pine, which was comforting, and the sight of an open coffin, which was macabre. At great celebrations, the people cover the floor with pine needles, creating a kind of soft, natural carpet on the concrete, as well as a kind of Nordic incense. The open coffin was the homemade coffin that Father Rother's body had laid in at his funeral there 2 years before. Afterward, his body was placed in a metal coffin and flown to Oklahoma City. So the people there had placed this memorial on a pair of sawhorses in the middle of the aisle, a reminder of the day of his death 2 years before. Its morbidity was softened by a powder blue co-op hat that had been placed at the head of the coffin, a hat that Stan had worn, and there was a small strand of entwined Christmas lights that were blinking and playing a soft version of Jingle Bells. I felt sad and charmed and intrigued all at the same time. Truly, it was overwhelming being a part of the life of the parish for just one afternoon. I could hardly believe I was present in such a place that had become a cornerstone element of the history of Oklahoma. There was poverty on the faces and in the scrawny arms and legs of the people gathered there. And foreignness, too. Everyone spoke the harsh, guttural sounds of Tzutujil, their native Mayan language. And above all, there was the intense sense of faith and identity. Walking up to the church there, which had stood there 400 years before our encounter with it, I could feel that every person there knew that that church belonged to him. As poor and shabby as it might be, as stained and faded as the statues were, as dark and cracked as the rereros behind the altar were, it was theirs, and they were ennobled by it. This feeling never left me. We came home from our trip and made our report to the Archbishop. We recommended reopening the mission and staffing it with Oklahoma priests and doing so as soon as was possible. The Archbishop heard us and responded by sending Father Tom McSherry there as Oklahoma's continuation of its commitment to the people and to the mission. He arrived in October of 1984 and stayed until July of 2001, a total of 17 years, more than half the time that Oklahoma sponsored the mission there. During his time, I had the chance to visit Father Tom while he was there. He was a consummate host and a wonderful friend to all of the American missionaries in Guatemala, as well as to us visitors from Oklahoma. In my time there, I began to appreciate the tough realities of the place and the challenges that the people faced there. For the first 20 years of visiting, the insurgency and the resulting civil unrest were the dominant aspect of the whole country, and especially of Santiago Atitlan. The army occupied the village during this time and cast a pall over everything. And while this unrest took place, the people were pretty much left to fend for themselves. They opted for subsistence agriculture and did their best to squeeze a living from the land there. Since there were few guarantees of settled life and no real markets available, most everyone lived from field to table with almost no cash in the village at all. It was common to see men walking to their fields carrying their hoes and machetes as they made their way up the volcanoes around the village to their fields. Every evening they trudged back. The young women would make their way to the shores of the lake to carry water and prepare for the last meal of the day. It was poor and dusty and regular. In fact, on the 25th anniversary of Father Rother's death, when I had visited Guatemala perhaps 20 times, I saw a young boy ride a bicycle across the plaza in front of the church. I realized then that I had never seen a bicycle in the village during all my time there. It simply was not the case that anything as expensive or luxurious as that would be there. Not to mention the fact that a bicycle on the steep dirt paths winding through the village didn't really make much sense. During those years, poverty and neglect and fear dominated the landscape there. It was true of the churches in the country as well. They were important to the people of their respective places, but the general poverty of the country was reflected in the upkeep of their sacred spaces. Hardly a church escaped the combination of cobwebs, leaks, faded frontage, and all manner of general neglect. Above all, more than anything else, they looked poor. In the context of war and suffering, it only made sense the facades of their sacred spaces suffered as much as the people did. After Father McSherry left Santiago in 2001, I didn't have the same opportunities to visit as previously. I participated in the 5-year interval pilgrimages sponsored by the Archdiocese, as well as a few independent trips I made on my own. In 2019, I was present at the celebration of Father McSherry's memorial mass in the village following his untimely death that year, and I began my sabbatical year in 2021 by being present for the 40th anniversary of Father Rother's death. My association with this spot in the highlands of Guatemala now stretches back more than 40 years. So when I visit these days, I see through eyes conditioned by how things used to be. Now, that's a bit of a bore for the people I'm traveling with, since I so often try to tell them about the passing of the decades and the changes that I see. But I suppose it's the inevitable price of having lived through these times and having been captured by the beauty and the power of what I first saw when I had that chance to visit all those years ago. To use just one figure, the town when I first arrived, Santiago, had a population of 25,000. Today, it's a town of 55,000. Everything about it has changed from when I first stepped out onto the plaza there. The first change of note is to acknowledge the blessings of peace. Instead of the hovering menace of the army, there's the obvious signs of prosperity and progress. Whether these signs are of goodness or of decay is a question yet to be answered in the dynamic of the world spirit. But suffice it to say that in the decades past, the great concern was malnutrition, disease, and a deadened spirit brought on by the difficulties of facing the world of violence and discord. These concerns no longer exist in the dynamism of the economy now present. Peace is a blessing. The most obvious signs of this is the transformation of what had been an army base on the highway to the regional capital that was changed into a University of Guatemala extension campus for agricultural education. It's amazing to drive by and see the signs inviting people into this space rather than guard towers warning people to stay away. This is a transformation that's evident in the entire country. But not only that, the money consumed in the military and by the voracious appetites of violence and security is now available for education. In Santiago Atitlan, it was previously impossible to get much of an education. When Father Rother arrived in the village there weren't any schools affordable to the people. The national language of Spanish wasn't much spoken there, especially by the women of the village, which kept the people in isolation and poverty. Today, there are a number of schools providing education for the children, including one supported by our archdiocese, and they learn there. The norm is that the kids speak Spanish as their lingua franca. And the largest source of income for the whole country is now tourism. This transformation has brought prosperity in ways unknown to this part of Guatemala. It's true, such a change is fickle. Just note the places all over the world that have become vulnerable to the changes of taste and interest of visitors and suffer the ups and downs of style and travel and tours. But in Santiago, this change has rendered an extraordinary alteration in things. 30 years ago, for example, there was no place in town to have a meal except at the parish rectory. Now you can stroll through the town and enjoy everything from seafood restaurants to ice cream and coffee shops. And along with these facile changes are more substantial ones as well. Santiago has running water and a sewage treatment facility. The people don't get their water from the same places where they wash their clothes and where the runoff from the streets and latrines splash into. The transportation has also been facilitated by the 300 enclosed three-wheelers called worldwide tuk-tuks, named after their two-cycle engines sputtering up and down the hills there. They're even licensed and registered. In a place where a bicycle was unknown a generation ago, there's now regular taxi service. Changes aren't just on the surface either. Every church I visited in the country seems sparkling new. While the building may be 400 years old, as is the church in Santiago, they are well-tended, freshly painted, clean, and as far as I could tell on a brief visit, full. At the very least, there are resources and money that have been used to make the churches presentable and functional. In Santiago, the most notable changes I've noted is that the parish has new pews and they have seating outside for overflow. Not only that, they have video cameras and audio facilities that are at least as good as the technology available in many of our own parishes, and in many cases, actually better. A couple of years ago, when the cathedral here in Oklahoma City was being remodeled, someone admonished the cathedral staff that the audiovisual resources in Santiago Atitlan were already superior to what was being planned to be installed for the refurbishment of the cathedral here in Oklahoma City, much less than what they were currently using. It's remarkable to note that what now passes for the norm in this remote highland town, which used to be notable for its isolation and backwardness, is now, it's now at the cutting edge. But in all these changes, my critical eye noted some sadness as well. The great irony is the loss of the sense of uniqueness in the village. When Stan arrived there in 1968, 98% of the village spoke Sutujil, and most didn't speak anything else. Now, the kids are learning Sutujil in their classrooms because they're not speaking it at home. They risk being overwhelmed by the dominant culture. What will happen to this people and their culture? It's a question unanswered. In the interviews that Father David Monahan collected as he was working on his still unpublished book about Father Rother, he talked to a number of those who were working with the Oklahomans as they founded the mission in Santiago. Several of them were actually opposed to helping with schools and adult education, as had been proposed, because those things interfered with the structure of the culture there. The native Mayan culture existed on the fringe of the Spanish-speaking non-Indian society, members of which were known as Ladinos. Several of the mission team thought they were simply making the natives into Ladinos and furthering the conquest and exploitation of the native people by the dominant culture. They were afraid they were facilitating the extinction of everything that had held the Sutujil people together for centuries. Their greatest fear was that instead of preaching the gospel of Christ, they were poisoning the people with the gospel of progress. This was a bitter division among the Oklahoma team, one that was never resolved. One example comes to mind every time I think of those questions. Several times I had the chance to spend my summer vacation in Santiago, several times replacing Father McSherry so that he could be on vacation. In that time, I used to look forward to the bustle of activity at about 5:00 p.m. every day. Walking through the streets, you could see young women scurrying to their houses and bustling about their yards, often putting on clean blouses and staring into the tiny slivers of mirrors on the porch posts outside their front doors. The young men would also come in from the fields and rush home to put on clean shirts and shoes. With their water jugs on their heads, then the young women would sashay down the paths between their houses and along the streets to fetch water up from the lake. And the guys would position themselves along the way so as to catch the girls' eyes as they came by, going and coming in this daily chore. It was charming for me. I didn't have to carry water, and I didn't have to live with getting by on 5 gallons a day from the lake. But it made for part of the drama of life in the village, an immemorial custom of love and life and work there. Now, with running water for just about everyone, and all of the ease and cleanliness it brings, this practical custom is gone. I appreciate the practicality of running water, but I also note that was something lost in the apportionment of work and leisure there. It's a small thing, I know, but it's a real one. Every change comes at a price. Most often, none of those involved in the change will know what the price will be. Ironically, Father Stan never faced these questions directly. So many other challenges faced him as he strove to be with his people that he didn't have the time to do much more than to try to survive. He learned their language and adapted himself to the culture, which he valued and appreciated as much as anyone. Now, his fame as a beatified martyr contributes to the change of lifestyle because of tourism and the alteration of the cultural understanding of Santiago. He who loved the people he served and wanted to see the best for them has contributed to a tremendous sea change in their expectations and experiences. I wonder if he would even recognize the place. Of course, this is me talking. Over the years, I've noticed that I've hardened in the viewpoints through which I see the world. As I've gotten older, the credulity with which I experience the world has become less flexible. I'm less open to seeing what's new, less apt to accept what I see on the surface, and find it to be a manifestation of what I already know and expect. Instead of seeing and holding on to moments that capture my imagination, I tend to pay more attention to my internal dialogue about noting how things used to be compared with how they are now. In my mind, I'm constantly feeling and saying to my companions, "You should have seen it 40 years ago." Allowing myself to let go of the desire to freeze everything in amber so that it continues and conforms to the beauty and uniqueness I found there all that time ago, I become numb to the changes I don't like or that I haven't gotten used to yet. There's also the personal possessiveness I have that I have experienced with regard to all these things, possessing my experience and my memories only to find that they exist now only in memory. There's almost no firm connection, no touch point in which I can find some access from the present to the past. It feels as if what I've had in my experience is now lost to me. Perhaps all of us older men feel this way about everything. Certainly I feel that way about Guatemala and Santiago Atitlan. Going to Guatemala is a journey into the life of the gospel in our time. It carries with it the invitation to acknowledge a life of bravery and martyrdom. And it's also a story of our time, in which the outlines of good and bad are easy to affirm, but are often blurred. Above all, it's a celebration of life, which is always a part of the celebration of the church. To come to Santiago Atitlan is to enter into the church, which is one reason I always look forward to going there. Back in just a moment. Welcome back to our final segment, Faith in Verse. We have a poem today called, "Do You Have a Pen?" Have you noticed the lowly pen even the casual scholar uses? We are, it seems, condemned to its widespread abuses. Oh, no open complaints about it. We're not at all concerned that such pens don't fit as the world's needs have turned. We only note they're everywhere, in each desk and every drawer. It's hardly a chance to share, no matter whether there are 2 or 4. Imagine getting a Bic for Christmas and trying then to be grateful. Your thank you would be listless, your appreciation lateful. It works perfectly fine wherever it happens to appear. Its ubiquitous presence aligns with what we hold dear. For we value cheap and ready, such a useful thing everywhere, our needs met, right now and steady, without a thought or care. That's, do you have a pen? It is a blessing for all of us to remember where we come from and what the source of our life really is and what it means to live what we have received in the context of our own lives. That's what we try to do here at Living Catholic. It's what all of us do as those who have inherited such a rich and varied history. I hope that you can join us in the weeks to come as we continue to explore this in our lives.
Living Catholic is a production of Oklahoma Catholic Radio. To learn more, visit okcr.org.